I am Jim Collison, and this is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on November 21st, 2024. Call the Coach is a resource for those who want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, we'd love to have your questions in chat, or if you're listening to the podcast or YouTube video after the fact, you can always send us your questions, coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to follow or subscribe to the podcast app or on YouTube there so you never miss an episode. Katie Hummel is our host today. Katie is a senior workplace advisor here at Gallup. And Katie, it's always a great day to be around you and always a great day to have you on Call to Coach. Welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Excited to be here.
Great to have you here. We've got a fabulous guest today. I'll give you a second for you to introduce her.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I am excited to be announcing my guest today, who's Elizabeth Luzardo, who is the Senior Director of Talent Strategy and Operations at iHerb. Elizabeth leads with her top 5, which are positivity, empathy, strategic, belief, and responsibility. And Elizabeth, iHerb has been partnered with Gallup over the past 4 years in many different areas, mainly employee engagement, but also CliftonStrengths. I would love if we could start our conversation today talking about what prompted you to reach out to Gallup originally and what the past 4 years have looked like.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you, Jim. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you, and engagement is my favorite topic, so I'm really excited to discuss it with you today. And it's been an absolute incredible journey with Gallup and iHerb over the last 4 years. We've really come a long way working together, learned a lot about our team members, and really how to best serve them. So iHerb is on a mission to make health and wellness accessible to all. So a part of that mission in caring for our customers is starting with caring for our team members. So when we were on the exploration of figuring out how to learn more about our team members, the Gallup-backed data, the way the survey is constructed really spoke to us and how our culture is constructed. So prior to partnering with Gallup, thinking about clocking in, logging in, we were really having a conversation around satisfaction, which really only got us so far. So moving into implementing the survey and then discussing engagement, again, brought us to a new level of conversations with our team members.
Wow.
So thinking about the very first year, we achieved a lot. It was right during the time of COVID. And prior to partnering with Gallup, our satisfaction surveys had about a 22% response rate. So when I went into our results for the very first time, I honestly was floored seeing that we had a 93% response rate across the globe. So instantly, our team members really showed us that they trusted the survey, that they knew that the confidentiality was there. They really felt that they could honestly answer the questions and then share a lot of feedback through the open-ended comments. So confidentiality was one way that really helped our team members buy in with that trust at the first and front part of the survey experience. And then when we went into the second year, we were experiencing a lot of different organizational changes. We, again, were opening the conversation about the importance of the survey, how we really wanted to know what was going on. And we had a 96% response rate that year.
Wow.
And we actually saw an increase at a time during the world. A lot of people were decreasing still. So thinking about organizational changes and maybe the hesitation that companies or teams could have when you are going to launch a survey, I always recommend don't hesitate. Take the survey because you want people to know and feel that you care about their opinion, you care about their feedback, no matter what's going on in the organization. And we had a lot of transparent conversations through those org changes. And that's what we got to see and realize through the engagement survey feedback and having an increase in a year where we may have potentially thought prior to the survey that we might not see that result. Going into last year, which was our third year, we had a stabilization of our scores. And that's where the Gallup benchmark data really helped us advance the conversation. So we had already had really open conversations about the importance of the survey, trusting the survey. We want you to participate. We want you to answer the questions you feel comfortable answering. Where getting results that were stable made me take a step back again and say, okay, how do we interpret these? So Gallup partnership, all the database comparisons helped leaders and teams gain more confidence in knowing, how should we approach this? And are we following the trends that we're seeing in the US? Are we following the trends that we're seeing across the globe? Is there something that we could be doing or should be doing a little bit differently? And I'm happy to announce that we just finished year 4. So we actually completed our 4th year survey just a couple weeks ago. We had another response rate in the 90th percentile, which we're so proud of, and we want to continue. And then we ended up having another increase this year. So I love statistics. It's, I think, a part of my genes. And when I saw the trending data, I just was, again, floored and really proud of the team in taking on the ownership of engagement, which is really where I think the collaboration piece comes into the conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing in so much more detail about what that year by year process looks like, because sometimes on that engagement journey, of course, you see increases. Sometimes you see stabilization, like you said, but taking all of that information into account, knowing that it's still a representation of where your employees are and what they're needing at that particular point in time is what really needs to be at the center to keep going. I'm curious, though, of course, we know through our conversations, it's not about just launching the survey. It's about the strategies that are implemented pre, during, and post survey that open the door for those productive conversations and for the opportunity to take that step forward. What were some of the greatest things that you did pre, during, and post survey to continue on that upward trajectory?
Thank you, Katie. So our HR team here at iHerb works really hard throughout the whole year to keep the conversation going about engagement being a daily choice. So it is up to all of us when we clock in, when we log in, if we're going to be engaged or not today. And when I think about being engaged, it's about being open to those conversations, expressing how you're motivated, how you're inspired, what do you need that day? Do you have questions or concerns about something? So we really in HR role model what it means to make that choice. And then we empower our team members and our leaders to role model that as well. So before the survey specifically, we do a lot of workshops. We have special workshops for people leaders where we talk about the survey itself, any frequently asked questions. We really encourage people leaders to share the list of questions and remind everybody why we're taking the opportunity to do this, how it really helps us strengthen our culture, empower our team members. We have special workshops that we invite all team members to. So especially if it's their first year with us taking the survey, they might want to have some more information, more details. So we again give that opportunity to them. We put on demand content for all of it. We leverage our CCTV systems in our distribution center and fulfillment centers. So that when people are in the lunchroom or taking breaks, again, clocking in, clocking out, we have all of the statements, all the questions, and we put the behaviors that we're looking for each question. Why would we ask you why we care about you knowing what's expected of you at work that day? Why do we want to know that you have the right materials and equipment to do your job right? So we really go beyond, hey, this is a survey, it's important to us, it's important to you. And we say, this is why it's important to you. And this is how we're going to use that information, because we really, truly want to make this the best working place that we can make it. We also talk a lot about engagement in our town halls that we do each quarter. We have a lot of senior leadership communication regarding engagement and the importance of keeping that conversation open throughout the year. And again, it's all about being transparent about why we are conducting the survey, and most importantly, why engagement is a topic that we should all be accountable to each day.
Absolutely. And so what I'm hearing you say is it's not only about that top-down approach when we're talking about our executive leadership team and the understanding of why are we doing this, but it's also that understanding that this is infused into the each and every day practice. It's infused into conversations at the local level. It's infused into the manager experience and the individual contributor experience as well. And there's an accessibility piece of bringing it up as frequently as possible. One thing I want to double click into that you specifically have worked on over the past few years has been bridging the gap for those managers who are leading international teams. Perhaps a manager and a few team members are sitting in California and the rest of their team is across the world. Would you mind sharing a little bit more about how you ensure that conversation can span across cultures and different geographic locations?
Great question, Katie. So being at iHerb, we are a global organization and we have leaders spread throughout most of the continents. And this, again, was a big reason for why we leaned towards Gallup and ended up partnering with all of you on the survey. The survey allows people, regardless of where they are in the globe, to take the survey in their native language so that they do feel comfortable and confident in what's being asked of them to rate and how they're going to make that appropriate selection. We also leverage a lot of custom translations so that we, again, can open up the conversation and allow people to add those open-ended comments or open-ended statements. And one thing I also really like is the data benchmarking, just the comparison data so that, for example, one of our largest teams is located in China, they can understand, okay, what is maybe the strength that we're seeing with most teams in China? What is that area of opportunity that we want to continue to explore in China? And how does that cultural difference come into play when we have managers that are in the US or in another area of the world and their team members are in a different part? So it, again, really helps you figure out how to approach that conversation in a comfortable, confident way, whether you're answering the survey or you're a leader supporting that team member and understanding what a 3 might mean to someone in one part of the world versus a 4 to someone in another part of the world. And embracing diversity and inclusion is one of our shared values here as well. So we really want this to, again, be an opportunity where people feel included, that they feel heard, and that they have that opportunity to really have the conversation that they want to.
Elizabeth, when you were setting this up, it sounds to me, I think sometimes when people think about surveying the organization, it's like, let's get a few questions, we'll send it out, hopefully we get a response. But it sounds like you guys did a lot of thoughtful pre-work into how do we set this up to be successful. Of the few things that you did, what are you really glad? I mean, what did you learn through those? You've done this 4 times now. What works best for you in that? Maybe 1 or 2 things that you would say, because I don't think it's natural. I think we just want to blast that thing out and hope we get responses, where you really approach it from an intentional standpoint. 1 or 2 things that you just say, yeah, we do this every time.
Thank you, Jim. So we make this an exciting event during the year. So we really do a lot of that pre-communication weeks leading up. Again, focusing on the empowerment of our team members and how this is a great opportunity for you to share that feedback. We want to hear it all year long. We want you to share it in one-on-ones and team meetings with your business partners, with your fellow team members. But please take this opportunity to give your feedback. So we make it a celebration. And then I think that number one thing goes back to the workshops. It really, again, allows some of those questions to come up that perhaps when you get the survey invite, or we use a QR code system for our hourly operations team members, we prevent some of those questions that perhaps people wouldn't have asked once opening the survey. Maybe they have, figured out that dedicated time in their schedule to take the survey and they feel that time pressure. Well, because they heard from the workshop why we would ask that statement, they're able to properly complete or properly answer those statements and not just decide, oh, I'll get back to this later and then maybe forget it. So all of the transparency in what the statements are, why we ask these, giving that opportunity to ask questions prior to opening the survey, I think that is one of our key success indicators.
Yeah. Figuring out how you can get ahead of those questions so people feel teed up to be successful during survey and after survey certainly helps that flow of conversation. And to your point, makes it more of a celebration and not an anticipated stressful experience. I know outside of the engagement survey as well, talking about events throughout the year and how we can ensure people are comfortable. I know outside of the engagement survey, outside of the Q12, you've also done other surveying throughout the year, whether it's through pulse surveying or 360s. Tell me a little bit more about what that additional survey experience has been like and how you are using additional surveying to add new touch points to the talent experience at iHerb.
So we really like the Gallup database of questions. And when I discovered those, and specifically the leadership effectiveness grouping of questions,
Mhm.
I had one of those light bulb moments of, oh, we need new leader transition surveys. So we started piloting with directors and above at iHerb first, and then expanding it from there to have new leader transition surveys after a leader has either joined iHerb or taken over a new team about 90 days to 6 months after they've joined, to really give them that good pulse point of, how is my intended personal brand matching the impact that I'm making on my team? Where are those areas that I have discovered information about them regarding engagement? Where might they be holding back information, since this is a new relationship that I should explore or learn more about? So new leader transition surveys is where we started first. And then it became I want a survey. Can I move into a 360? Can I get a pulse survey on my team? We just went through this change, or we're really going through a very major project, and I am a little nervous about burnout. I want to know if my team is feeling burnt out and how we might be able to best address that or best support the team moving forward. So then we started to explore some of the other pulse survey capability for 360s. And we always use the pulse survey capability for leaders after the annual engagement survey, specifically any leaders that have a score in the lowest 25% of the Gallup database. We have one-on-one coachings with them in a way of partnering. So all of the leaders, the talent team, HR business partner come together. We look at the scores, we talk about them, and figure out that one area to keep focusing on. And then we do a pulse survey. And most of the time we do see a lot of that great fulfillment of, okay, our action plan's on the right track. We want to keep navigating in this direction. It gives a lot of comfort and confidence to leaders to then get ready for that next annual engagement survey. We don't just use the pulse survey capability, though. We also use the onboarding and exit interview capability with Gallup, and we actually integrate all of that with Workday as well. So whenever we have these automatic job changes or tasks, it makes it really easy for the team member to then move into a Gallup survey, which helps us map out engagement in all of these different times of the employee life cycle, which again is really interesting to look at from a trending perspective and thinking about, okay, this is a vulnerable point for our team members. What's going on at this point? Are we able to support them in a different way? Should we be talking about something prior to this tenure point so that we can increase engagement and we can kind of eliminate some of this up and down that we see throughout the employee life cycle? So if you're able to incorporate surveying at onboarding, through engagement, pulse surveys, new leader transition, they help with that development side. And then the exit interviews, again, give you a lot of great data to think about how to attract potential data and also to continue to grow and retain the talent that you already have at your organization.
Okay, I just want to do an instant replay quick and give some recognition because the idea of surveying being used as an anticipatory tool versus a reactionary, oh gosh, iHerb just sent me a survey, they're trying to look for something. That cultural shift is one that a lot of our clients and partners out there are kind of beginning to ideate about. How can we start to drive managers, leaders alike to see this as a tool to get ahead, to put their individual contributors ahead, and not necessarily as a tool that we should be nervous about leveraging over time. And so I just want to give the biggest kudos to you because that's a hill that many are trying to climb. And the fact that you're already seeing this, not only acceptance, but excitement around, okay, I think I'm seeing conflict. Let's double click into this right now while I'm at the beginning stages and not when it's too late and we have a lot to figure out. I want to also talk about this employee life cycle. One thing you and I have talked about specifically outside of an employee's experience already working at iHerb is what happens before they work at iHerb, while they're in that hiring experience. Can you tell me, how are you using employee engagement before somebody joins your team?
Great question. So I love our employee value proposition, which is for a better you. The team members at iHerb hear me say that countless times throughout the day and the week. Every workshop we end with for a better you. So that employee value proposition actually came from all the discovery when we first started with engagement surveys. We were still defining, who are we as an organization? What are our shared values? How do we talk about our culture with others? So the feedback really was a gift for helping further define that part of our culture. And in our interviewing process, engagement is one of those items that we are looking for in terms of skills, experience. Specifically, if we're hiring for people leaders, we want them to know how important this is for their role and how the managers create the environment for engagement to happen each and every day. So we really want to know how people have already done that, know that it's a part of who they are. One thing that I also talk a lot with our team members about in terms of engagement is finding those habits that you incorporate into your day-to-day so that engagement is not just a checklist item. It's really something that becomes a part of you and almost becomes an autopilot item. So we really talk about that during the interview process. We want people to know that the way that we navigate decisions here, the way that we approach projects is really for a better you. So if you go to our career website, careers.iherb.com, you'll see all of our shared values. You'll see engagement. You'll understand more about our culture. Certainly, again, a part of the interviewing process to be transparent about so that team members and people leaders know when you join iHerb, we want you to be engaged. We want you to have open dialogue, have open conversations with your leader. One of our shared values is be entrepreneurial and pivot quickly. And I always think about that one with engagement. If we are not engaged, we are going to lose out on some great ideas that can help our customers, that can help our business, that can help our team members. So that's what we're looking for when we're going through interviewing.
That is fantastic. And I absolutely love the value proposition of for a better you. I also love what you said, that feedback is a gift. I feel like I'm really sensing your positivity coming out and putting the positive spin on the fact that people share feedback because they want to invest in you and see a brighter future and outcome for yourself, for the team, for the project you're representing. So I know outside of engagement, you also are a certified strengths coach, and you've worked over the past few years to bring CliftonStrengths to iHerb and also infuse it into conversations, whether it be about the values, your culture, about where you're going in your career. Tell me more about how you knew it was time to bring strengths into the conversation and what it looked like to expand that team by team.
Thanks, Katie. So after the very first year, after we had that great participation with engagement, I knew that iHerb was ready for strengths. So we identified specific teams and leaders. We actually started with our largest group within iHerb, which is our operations team. So they're spread out throughout the United States, and we have hundreds of operations leaders helping create that wonderful customer experience. And so starting with the largest group might not be where everyone goes to on this call and thinking about piloting. It was the best way to really help show and tell the story of the power of strengths. And when I think about how strengths assists engagement, it helps you bring authenticity into the conversation that you're already having. So how can I be engaged at work? How can I be motivated? What inspires me? What do I need? What do I want? When you add in the layer of strengths, it then brings authenticity and genuineness into, this is me. This is how I'm my best. This is how I am going to operate. I have had a lot of conversations with my team members specifically that have some dominant strengths that are my lesser strengths. And I tell them, I'm so thankful for you. I'm so thankful you're on my team. And sometimes we know with certain strengths, there can be a little natural tension or a little opposite effect that happens. And I think when you get that information about yourself and your teams, you can alleviate or remove some of those assumptions that all of us as humans try to make when we're trying to understand someone better or trying to work through something. So we talk a lot about intent versus impact. And really, again, this is where I'm going to be coming from. Don't move into this assumption about me. Let's focus on that shared purpose. Let's focus on that shared goal. And if there's something that really creates unnecessary stress for you, I'm always talking about that with my team too, especially with question number 2 on the engagement survey. I'm like, I want to know about that. If you're not a morning person, then I want to know, because that's something that we can easily work through, that maybe the rest of your day is going to be a lot smoother, a lot better. And therefore, you're going to perform at a higher level. You're going to be more productive and you're going to be more engaged, and you're also going to be happy. So we really want people to feel fulfilled here. And that's where strengths comes into play too. Again, it gives you comfort and confidence to say, this is who I am. This is where I'm at. And then you can have those open career conversations with your leader about how you apply that to the job that you're in right now, how you explore new skills or new areas of opportunity within the company. So that's where the conversation has also shifted, moving into the 3rd year of strength and allowing more team members at iHerb to have strengths. We can then incorporate it into those career conversations.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. Top of the pyramid, thinking about question 11, question 12, even question 3. I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day, and bridging that gap between what you're intending someone to do and what they're actually experiencing. I want to bring it back to surveying for a moment. Jacob actually put a great question in the chat here for us. Do you ever experience survey fatigue? And if so, how do you tackle that?
Great question, Jacob. I just saw that too, Katie, so I'm glad that you picked that up. And I have been a part of different teams and organizations where we were surveyed quite a bit. And when we started this process with Gallup at iHerb, we did really focus on that one annual survey first, getting the buy-in, getting the trust there, and then moving into pulse surveys just for specific pilots of the organizations. And I think whenever you move into pulse surveys, you really have to make sure that people know the direct reason why. No, this is not just another survey. This is a survey to help you with X, Y, and Z. This is to help you as a leader specifically. This is to help you really measure the change that you just went through, for you to see and understand if your action plan is on the right track. So right now, all of our team members just have the one annual survey that we navigate through each year. And then the pulse surveys are all of those specific pilot groups. Now, going to over surveying, I can think about onboarding and exits. Those are very specific points of the employee life cycle. And we actually did start with quite a few surveys when we first started onboarding. So week 1, month 2, month 3. And that's where, when we evaluated that program, we took a step back and said, well, maybe we can change that up a little bit. So I do think it's an important conversation, Jacob. And I think it's best to get the buy-in with the annual survey first, go through the very specific populations that could benefit from a pulse survey. And then if you do those ongoing surveys, such as onboarding or exits, be really strategic about how many you're doing at those touch points, so that people don't just X out of the survey and say, well, I've already taken this before.
Well, and let's be really clear. Survey fatigue happens when you ask questions and nothing happens, right? Or things don't get done. No one complains when they give their opinion and then things start to change, or they see, active action planning or things happen around that. It sounds like you're in tune to that now, and that, you're able, because you can, if you ask the questions and you're not expecting to do anything about it, people are like, well, why did I answer that? Right. But if it can be actionable, I don't know, Elizabeth, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because when we first started with onboarding and exits, it was really hard for me to follow up specifically with exits. We have really strong retention here, which we're really proud of. So going into those reports and not being able to have the same kind of follow-up and action planning that we did with the annual engagement survey did kind of slow that project down a little bit. And then in terms of survey fatigue, one thing that I think helps with that is the length of the survey too, which is why we really like the Q12. And we just started doing the Q12 plus. We really want to learn more about meaningful feedback and well-being, but keeping the survey short. And again, helping everyone understand that each one of these questions was selected for a reason, I think really helps with the overall participation and the buy-in. So going back to the onboarding surveys real quick, we keep them very short and we really leverage basic needs for the first part of the onboarding experience. That's what you should have a lot of comfort with when you're first starting your role. And then we start to add in some of the other Q12 questions to monitor as they get closer to the 90 days, because at that point, you should know a little bit more about feeling your best at work and knowing more about your team. We know the growth and development questions 11 and 12 will take team members some time, so we keep those off the onboarding surveys. But thinking about the hierarchy of engagement is a great way to kind of split apart questions, to think about trends and also those really prime touch points of the employee life cycle, especially when somebody's onboarding and first starting with your company.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about the trend over time, as Chad was highlighting in the chat. To have 90% and higher participation is extremely impressive. But let's be clear, and I want to circle back to what you said when we opened our conversation today. Organizational change has surrounded iHerb for a couple of years now. It's not necessarily been smooth sailing or a guarantee that status quo is a go each and every single year. So as you've navigated change each year, made difficult decisions that have impacted the experience employees may or may not be having, can you talk me through your perspective and your decision to continue surveying during those times and not necessarily put engagement and surveying on the back burner when you might be anticipating receiving negative or decreased results?
Thank you, Katie, and thanks, Chad, for sending in that question. One thing that came to mind for me first and foremost is don't be afraid to keep focusing on those basic needs. So going back to the hierarchy of engagement, a lot of our teams, even moving into this fourth year, are continuing to stay committed to question number one. I know what's expected of me. So I think one thing that can happen as you navigate through the survey year after year is you think, well, I got to get to the next level. I have to get to the next question. But we can never take for granted question number one or our basic needs, especially when you are going through changes within the organization. My team combined with the talent acquisition team a couple years ago, and we became talent experience. It was another opportunity for me specifically as a leader to understand, okay, how is the team assimilating? How are we collaborating? We really have to take things back to the start. We can't just assume people know what's expected of them. How do we start from the beginning and build from there? So I think based on the participation, based on follow-up, it's always bringing yourself back to those basic needs first, making sure that you are reinforcing and continuing to stay committed to those actions and behaviors that the team members are receiving very well. And when you go through a change, we all navigate change differently, and some of us are going to take a little bit more time than others to navigate certain change. Don't be afraid to go back to basics. And leveraging the great resources in Gallup Access can really help with that too. Regardless of how many years you've been in the position you've been in, those are great starting points to say, okay, how can I have this conversation with team members in a new way? Or maybe this is my first time being a people leader and I don't know how to approach it. What are some of those great options that can help me get the information I'm looking for to really figure out those actions that are going to make a difference here? So one is go back to basic needs. Don't be afraid to do that. And then two, leverage all those great questions that are already in the database to help you open things up. One thing that I tell leaders, and I've said this a lot this week, is pick your question of the week, pick your question of the month. It doesn't have to be just that week, but whether you're at a distribution center, walking the floor, ask that question, find out more about it. Or if you're in a remote or a hybrid setting, make sure that it's a part of your team meeting coming up and figure out, what's behind the number that you're seeing on your engagement survey.
I am absolutely loving the intentionality in your coaching here, pointing out that it's the difference between asking one or two questions and not asking anything at all, pointing out that the resources already exist, and sometimes it's just amplifying that golden nugget for somebody to take and run with. But then also reassuring your team members that to focus on basic needs in year 4 is not a loss. It's actually critical, and it will set you up for greater success long term. Oh, and by the way, that conversation very well may change month over month. So you need to circle back. And it's normal for it to change, and it changes regardless of your industry, the changes you're experiencing, or the consistency you're seeing. One success that I do want to make sure we highlight during our conversation today, and I know we're going to hear a collective sigh from the audience about question 10, best friend at work. Specifically, Elizabeth, you all saw a major increase in question 10 going from year 2 to year 3. It was a 0.21 increase. So for anybody tuning in, iHerb exceeds 1,000 people. So what we would classify as meaningful change is a 0.1 increase. So not only did they see meaningful change, they doubled it for some context. Many organizations we know are intimidated by question 10, I have a best friend at work. And they often see decreases as an effect of maybe being intimidated by that question. How did you manage to drive such meaningful change, and what does it look like now?
I'm so glad you're asking this, because I do think it's almost everybody's favorite question to talk about, especially before, during, and after the survey.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember going through engagement champion training and also thinking, well, how am I interpreting this question? Do I have a best friend at work?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we approach this question and we talk about it with team members, that's one thing we really make clear, is that the way I think about best friend at work might be different than the way you think about best friend at work. And a best friend at work is probably going to be a little bit different than maybe your best friend at work outside of work, excuse me. So what we did differently, when I reflected on that data shift, I also took one of those pause moments of, how did we do this? This is incredible. This is statistically significant. It was all going back to that pre-survey communication. So in that year, we did more marketing, more communication about each statement and why we were asking it. So going to the CCTVs in our operations locations, we had individual slides on every single statement. And this was one we made sure was displayed. This is the statement, and this is why we're asking it. We want to know, do you have mutual trust at work? Is there someone that you're looking forward to seeing, someone that you feel comfortable talking to? Maybe it's venting, maybe it's asking a question, maybe it's sharing an idea with your best friend at work before you feel comfortable or confident sharing it with your people leader or your business partner. So making sure that people know that best friend at work is going to be different for probably every single one of us is one way to start. 2 is going back to the pre-survey communication of, why would we even ask this question? This is why, and this is what we want to know. And then 3, I think one thing that we did better that year as well was just making sure people know that every statement is optional to answer. So that's one thing that I really like about the Gallup advice with the survey too. And I know that it really helps with that overall participation drive. So when we make sure that people know you don't have the pressure to answer this statement if you don't have all the information just yet, I think allowed people that less pressure to actually answer it moving into year 3 after they had heard us say that a couple years. And we do see that as the statement with the lowest response rate, but it's almost in line with all the other statements now with how much we talk about question 10.
Yeah, starting with the why, educating around what is this actually asking, and then letting people know, hey, if you don't want to answer it, that is completely fine. It starts to build up that mutual trust, because then if you skip it on this survey and suddenly you see your team member talking about it over there, you start to ask yourself, well, why did I skip it? Maybe I do actually have thoughts about this and opinions, or maybe I actually do feel like I have people I can trust and I should give my feedback around that.
And when we're looking at the survey data, all of our managers at iHerb right now are talking with their teams about their reports. The eyes always move towards question 10, especially if you see the colors changing a little bit around that point. And I just encourage our leaders and teams to, 1, recognize where it's at, but 2, remember to spend your energy and your resources to figure out that question to keep building the pyramid. And it is going to take us a lot of time to get to question number 10 in the hierarchy of engagement. So a lot of our teams have been focused on question 1, question 2 over the last couple of years. And just last year, we started to see more teams action plan on 3 and 4. And then as an organization, our low and high ranking items just moved to 5 and 6. So I also, again, had one of those pause moments of, whoa, we're going by the playbook here. We're kind of navigating through question by question. This is ideal. This is great. But it's important to note that that's not going to be what always happens with your organization or with your teams. There's constant change, whether it's role changes or leader changes, project changes, goal changes. So if you create and invest in these really wonderful, impactful habits as leaders and as team members, you're going to be able to have that higher level of agility to navigate through and to keep engagement as a part of the conversation, rather than waiting for a survey in the future and being surprised by, what people said or how they felt. So I think that's another thing that goes back to transparency with openness before, during, and after the survey. You get a lot less surprises, which really helps you feel more comfortable and confident in action planning. It lets you get to that next level of actions to take and different action planning, enhancements that you can make as well.
Elizabeth, it reminds me, I think over the last 4 years, Q10 is just one example of this. But for me personally, that I've answered that question a little bit different each year because of my work situation. 4 years ago, I was fully remote. 3 years ago, we were half and half. 2 years ago, I was making a shift to coming back in. Then even the people I interacted with, Katie, you're a part of this group. A couple of years ago, I started coming in and having lunch every day with our team, with our solutions teams. And that changed the group of people I hung out with. Have you experienced, from an organizational standpoint, have you had an effect like that where the situations change too, and those Q10s may morph or change or float around a little bit? I don't know. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, I certainly think so. And relator is one of my top 10 strengths. So I also reflect on that quite a bit and thinking about my openness to relationship building, yet with relator, the need for depth of connection. So when I do have someone that's joined the team or a new business partner, I try to be very intentional in thinking, what do they need to know about me? What do I need to know about them? And how can we really figure out what this mutual purpose, this mutual goal is, so that we can have that strong working relationship. So I think, especially if you're a relator, when you have those changes at work, maybe your best friend at work isn't on your team anymore, or maybe isn't at the organization anymore, be self-aware and understanding and knowing yourself in what you need and what you want from the relationships that you have at work. And don't be afraid to be a little vulnerable in sharing information about yourself so that you can open that door to relationship. So especially as relators, we might want that depth of connection that we think, oh, we're going to have a hard time finding this again. Well, there is commonality, there is trust that you can build across the organization. And there is a good place for you to start where you can be vulnerable and you can get to that depth quickly. So just based on your comfort and your vulnerability.
Katie, you advise, you consult across organizations. Any thoughts to this idea, as well as, over this course of times, things have changed and we're constantly adapting to these questions. That's kind of why we do it on a regular basis. Katie, would you add any wisdom to that as well?
Yeah, I would just add on top that remaining open-minded, it's similar to what Elizabeth said, but about all 12 of the questions, but specifically open-minded to the fact that everything could be changing in your personal life, everything could be changing in your current role, yet nothing could be changing at the organization, and starting to accept change as an opportunity to evolve yourself and not necessarily as something that warrants major course correction. It could be changing in the right direction, but your mindset towards accepting and being open to that, to open doors for yourself, for your team, for the goals that you're trying to achieve and that you're chasing year after year. That's how I think you start to shuffle through, okay, maybe my best friend doesn't work here anymore. Or, okay, we just added 3 new team members. Maybe I already have my best friend at work, But maybe one of those new 3 team members, they can be some of my additional best friends at work. As relators, I definitely lock into the sentiment of maybe I have that one, but what does it look like to add 2 or 3 or 4 more and be somebody else's go-to person? But the open-mindedness certainly is what comes to mind.
Yeah, well, and it doesn't need to be just about best friend. Materials and
Mhm.
equipment changed during those times for some people, right?
Right.
Not everybody, right? I know it's expected of me. Number one, that changed for some people during those times. So, Elizabeth, I think what I hear you saying is you're constantly having a finger on the pulse of
Yep.
where are we at today? What are the needs today, and how are we adapting and changing to that as well? Yeah,
And
Katie,
emphasizing, real quick, emphasizing that importance of participation is really where I think we alleviate some of the pressure
Mhm.
of people taking the survey, and really for leaders knowing and being clear about, we're going to see some changes here because I'm different today than I was yesterday. My team is different this month than they were last month. So you're correct, Jim, where, when we're looking at the data, we all default, I think, as humans saying, is this good? Is this bad? What am I going to do with this now? Where we've tried to change the conversation from good and bad to this is where we're at right now. So what are we going to do about it? And that also helps with the team accountability, the self-accountability that comes with engagement. And that's also been really fun to move into as we've moved into this 4th year with Gallup.
Yeah, I want to take a moment to double click into Cole's question in the chat. He is asking for some advice around what you would recommend leaders do to move from analyzing employee results to taking meaningful action. And you certainly have that strong coaching background, so I'd be curious to kind of hear how you would lead that conversation and guide somebody in that transition.
So as soon as we close the survey here at iHerb, I instantly start getting chats. When can I see my report? When can I see the data? And personally, I'm also waiting for the report to be available to me to say, well, what is it? What did we get? So again, going back to the excitement of the survey process, it's helpful when you make it that celebration and that anticipation of, okay, I really care and want to know where we're at, to then move into the steps of what are we going to do about it. So we do give leaders that first time look at their reports. I encourage all of them to do those self-reflection questions to really take it in and ask themselves, well, what surprised me? What did I agree with? What did I maybe pause and say, I need to learn more about that. So having your own list first, I think, is very helpful in taking in the information. And then we really encourage managers to start sharing their reports as soon as possible with their teams. So I think it was that day I chatted my team and said, these are our results. I can't wait to talk with you about them. I just looked at them. I'm reflecting. I want you to do the same thing so that we can have a really rich conversation when we get together live and through video call to talk about what we're going to do now, because it's up to all of us for what that best next step can be. So reinforcing the team accountability, reinforcing the manager role modeling that you need for the survey to take on a life after you see all of the numbers. The numbers help guide you, but you as a leader need to really help with that direction and help make sure those conversations are happening. So analyzing the results, reflecting first, encouraging your team to reflect so you can have really intentional, rich dialogue. And then what we do is the survey is done in every October. We take November and December to talk about it, to think about it. It's our time of year where we also have year-end reviews. So everybody's reflecting on the year. What went well? What could have gone better? What could have done differently? So it really is a nice segue to the new year. So when we all, start the new year in January, we have a clear direction of that one engagement item we are all committed to moving into that new year. So every team member here at iHerb has a goal in our goal setting process to help support engagement. And they know what statement and what question we're all working on together. So again, the team accountability, the manager accountability, and just the time of year can also really help with the follow-up of surveying and action planning.
Yeah. And if I'm hearing clearly, some of the success there that I'm pulling out, and I'll put it into my own words, keeping it simple. Very clear direction, hey, here are our results. Take a look, excited to hear your thoughts. Often sharing results and anticipating reactions can be a daunting task. And so keeping it simple and saying, here they are, let me know what you think. This is what I'm thinking about. Maybe if you want to get special with it, here are the 3 things that are top of mind for me. And this is when you can expect to hear more. And then even in that action plan, keeping it simple again, locking into one, not trying to eat the whole entire pie that's in front of you, but saying, this year, I'm focusing on question 3. Maybe this is what it means to me, but at the very least, knowing I'm focusing on question 3 and having that clear across the board, simple is always going to be more impactful. Last but not least here, Elizabeth, I have one more question for you. What is one more piece of advice that you have for other talent and HR leaders who are working on their engagement initiatives? Maybe they're just getting started, or maybe they're a few years down the journey and they're ready for a revamp.
So first, I want to reemphasize being clear about everyone's role in terms of engagement. So again, when you clock in, when you lock in, it's up to you if you're going to be engaged or not that day. And it's up to you to share that engagement with your leader. Again, if there's a challenge, if there's a frustration, if there's something you have questions about, being engaged is about being open to those conversations and having the conversations you need to have. So be clear about everyone's individual role is first. The second one is being transparent about all of the questions. So going back to all the pre-survey communication we do, we want to make sure that, again, people aren't just hearing from us one time a year on why we're doing the survey and what it is. We really want people to understand there's a reason for every single question. We want you to have that optionality of answering the ones you want, feeling comfortable and confident in what you answer that year versus last year. And then I think the third part goes to what we were just saying in the follow-up process, being authentic. So really helping leaders, helping teams figure out that one focus area, and for everyone to look at the report and say, yes, I'm a part of this team. I'm a part of the team that I want to create today. So what kind of team do I want to be a part of? How am I going to communicate with my team members today? How am I going to contribute today? And that's where, again, engagement starts to take on a life of its own, and you start to really take these action plans and make these great new habits, and it just becomes a part of who you are.
Elizabeth, you are speaking a lot of textbook. It's great to hear. Listen, Katie and I live this all the time. We do this internally. It's so amazing to hear it come from outside when people are really embracing it. You've been doing it 4 years. You couldn't make this up. It's not a one and done. And I want to say congratulations for all the great work that you've done there. You can kind of feel it in your voice, in what you're saying. Brooke asked a question out there to you specifically, and we kind of pre-gamed this a little bit when we were talking in the pre-show. He says, coming from someone with high positivity, how do you view or present the results without candy coating them? And I have positivity 6, so I do this as well. Thoughts on that and maybe even advice for your managers thinking about their top 5 as they bring the results to this as well. Your thoughts?
Thank you, Brooke. As positivity number 1, I completely understand where you're coming from with this and the reaction that you might get at times when you're approaching the reports with others. One way that I think about my positivity when approaching the results is, not everything on there you're going to be smiling and happy, like, oh, I'm so happy to see that I got, 5 3s on this specific question. It's not about candy coating it. It's not about being happy about everything on the report. Where I channel my positivity with teams is, this is how we move forward now. So looking towards the future, looking towards what's in our control. Now that we know what we know, what are we going to do about it? You have that opportunity now. So why don't you seize it? Why don't you do something with it? And look, we have all these proven strategies for what you could try doing. So you don't have to feel the pressure of a blank action plan. You can just look at these bullet points and pick one that sticks out to you first. And if you don't like that one, go to the next one. That's going to be fine. So again, it's not about candy coating it. We certainly look at all of the data, calling out the low ranking items, calling out the high ranking items, and figuring out how to channel that energy of accepting this is where my team is at. How do I help them all gain that team accountability of being a part of this team? And then moving forward, what we have now is the choice we're going to make next. So let's all move into that energy and that choice and do our best for each other.
I love that. Would you give the same advice? Katie asked you about advice you'd give to HR leaders. Do you think you'd give your managers the same advice about bringing feedback, which is be clear, be transparent, be authentic, and lean into your own strengths in giving this feedback? Any additional thoughts on that from managers delivering this feedback?
Great question, Jim. I do think that when you have strengths of the person that you're working with, it can be helpful. I know a lot of our managers here are very analytical. They're very strategic. A lot of them have input, so they want all of the data. I also can go and spend hours and hours and days in the Gallup reports if I wanted to. But I think that's one thing to keep in mind with coaching is that there's going to be a pullback point for everybody. Maybe you're centering it on one question. Your relationship building is high. So you're like, oh, best friend at work. Why is that so low? I need to figure that out. I need to care for it. I need to care for my people. Well, you can channel that energy and saying, well, the best way for you to care for your people is actually going back to question number one. Or if you're navigating through the data, maybe getting lost in some of the frequency distributions or the trending data or the heat map, as a coach, if you are working through that with a manager or a team, just making sure you're pulling it back and staying simple, like Katie said. There's a lot there. There's a lot of power. But do you help your managers and teams focus on that one thing? Once you make that the goal of the conversation, it again will help guide you in pulling back and not going down some of those rabbit holes.
Yeah, good advice. Katie, would you add anything to that from your experience working with other clients?
I don't think I would. Maybe I would add that if we're looking at a team, like you said, Elizabeth, knowing that many of your managers are analytical, if we're looking at a team that maybe has a lot pooled in one area or strengths that are scattered across the board, perhaps working with that manager to tee up their message to meet their audience a little bit better. When I'm approaching these conversations to a team full of individuals with positivity, my tone does look a little bit different as somebody with high command versus when I'm approaching a team that is filled with analytical thinkers. My approach is a little bit more direct and blunt. And so perhaps providing some of that extra reinforcement to managers who are new to the strengths conversation if they have that information available. And if they don't have that information available, helping them what I like to call strength spot. What do your team members typically react well to? What do they react poorly to? And help them kind of pull out their own thoughts, even if we don't have that documented quite yet, for people who are looking for that additional coaching.
Yeah. And in that strength spotting, the question to ask is, where are you the most productive? Right. And that, how are we the most productive in those? Well, we've had a lot of great things and a lot of great comments out there as well for those folks joining us live. Katie, let's thank Elizabeth for coming today and wrap this up.
Gosh, well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jim, first for having us. But Elizabeth, thank you for joining us in conversation, sharing all of these details. And thank you for being such a strong representation of everything fantastic that iHerb has to offer. It's been so exciting watching you go on this journey over the past 4 years and achieve so much through asking insightful questions, being intentional in the way that you're approaching and leveraging tools, but then also being open-minded in the way that you are exposing team members to new topics and conversations to set them up for success. And then I have to give a last congratulations to all of the team members, leaders, managers, individual contributors at iHerb who have made this 4-year journey possible and who have contributed to such impactful conversations that have left Elizabeth and I having a lot of fun when we're thinking about how we can support improvement over time. So cheers to you all. Congratulations. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Gallup, for the opportunity. I also really want to thank all of the iHerb team members. It's just such an incredible place to work that I am inspired each and every day by the commitment, the dedication, and the high quality of everyone there. And it's been wonderful to be a part of this engagement journey. And I can't wait to see where we go from here.
I always say, Elizabeth, thank you. I always say I have the best job ever, but it's mostly because I get to sit and listen to you, both of you, both representing Gallup and the work that's being done. Elizabeth, you representing an organization who really kind of cares about their people and what they're doing. And it's heartwarming. We hear plenty of stories where it's not. And so thank you for the work that you've done. Thanks for being willing to put all the time in to get this done. Appreciate you and your effort there as well. So thanks for coming on today.
Thank you.
With that, I'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources, and Elizabeth mentioned this, available inside of Gallup Access. Just log in, and we actually have a resource area where you can kind of search on just about anything and bring that stuff back. So check it out today. Log in my.gallup.com for coaching, master coaching, or if you want to become a Gallup certified strengths coach like Elizabeth is, you can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. We'll get that information back to you and help you do that. Stay up to date with all our future webcasts by following us on LinkedIn or in our Facebook groups. If you want more information about Clifton Strengths, you can do that just by searching Clifton Strengths literally on any social platform. We are there, and we make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons so you get all of our notifications. Thank you for joining us live. If you're listening to the recorded version of it, thank you for listening to it. We'll have more of these available as well, so make sure you subscribe, make sure you follow. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.